So Joe Biden appears confident of victory. He's saying it's only a few vote counts away, but counts continue to trickle in key states. The race remains uncalled, as you heard my colleague Nina Maria Potts say earlier on. Much of the focus on Pennsylvania's 20 electoral votes, enough at this stage to win Biden the presidency. As of late Friday, Biden was leading there by more than 28,000 votes, with 96% of the vote tallied. Meanwhile, President Trump continued to baselessly claim the election was being stolen from him, vowing not to concede the vote. As you heard my colleague says, he continues to tweet saying that he's won by a lot. Obviously something that's been flagged by Twitter as well. But for more on this, we're joined by political economist and senior research fellow at the Trade Collective, Ms. Lebohang Pheko. Very good evening to you, Ms. Pheko, and thank you so much for speaking to us. So, as I mentioned, Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, they're toss-ups. Nevada is set to likely be a Democratic state, including Arizona being set to be led by Biden. But most importantly, just looking at Trump himself, why does he appear so angry or refusing to concede if he has to? What is at stake for him?
So many things. I think there are a few things that we should look at. So there's the broad picture, which is what U.S. interests represent. And the traditional U.S. interests have usually been characterized as, firstly, global leadership. Secondly, the defense and promotion of international order. So this notion that America sees themselves as the world's prefects, essentially. Thirdly, the defense and promotion of democracy, freedom, and human rights, again, extremely problematic over the last few decades. And lastly, the prevention of competing hegemons, competing power structures, Europe, for example, the European Union, and China. But I would argue that President Trump has been a very inward-looking, nationalistic, narrowly nationalistic by his own confession and proclamation president, and that his primary interest has been to secure U.S. economic and corporate interests, both nationally and internationally. And essentially, this has included some quite controversial, but I think, controversial with the public perhaps, but extremely useful for the corporate sector, and which is including, fracking, oil interests, ensuring that countries like Sudan are taken off the list of countries which are sanctioned by the U.S., even though they fail all of their litmus tests that I have mentioned by their own narrow definition of what democracy is. And this is one of the reasons why we've seen the kinds of interferences and strange alliances with countries like the Soviet Union or Russia, I should say, and of course the interesting machinations taking place among the Arab oil-rich states and Venezuela of late. So I would argue that those are the...
I want us to look at that in detail in just a moment, but I want to look at President Trump's own financial personal disclosures. So he's said to have earned hundreds of millions of rands from foreign business dealings during his tenure. Does this translate into these U.S. corporate interests? Do they translate into government programs of foreign influence spending? Just looking at the countries that you mentioned and some of the machinations that we've seen play out in the global sphere.
Well, what this actually means is that essentially these influence the ways in which particular relationships are going to play themselves out. So we have seen, for example, the installation of extremely unpopular leaders in the last few months, in the last 12 months, particularly in Brazil, which is a key pole of power in Latin America. For the United States, a very right-wing, conservative, neoconservative, market orthodox, and some would say neoliberal, hawkish, U.S.-aligned head of state in that region. We've also seen the installation and in fact the installation of ongoing hostilities, the reinstatement of hostilities with Cuba, which were thawed somewhat, again problematically under President Obama, but which had been thawed to a great extent. This has meant that there have been medical embargoes, there have been health embargoes, there have also been massive mineral embargoes across several Latin American countries and across certain parts of the Middle East. East as a result of this very narrow nationalistic, but more than that, corporatist approach to international relations. And I would argue that rather than being concerned with the ways in which America can expand its international footprint, there's actually more about U.S. interests abroad. And there's a distinction between pursuing U.S. interests abroad and having an internationalist foreign policy.
So what would then be the distinct difference, and whose interest is it in? I mean, some of the countries that you've mentioned, and I'm looking at the influence that President Trump has had on countries like Turkey. You mentioned Saudi Arabia earlier on, Brazil, China, and Russia.
So I think that what we can see there is basically an attempt to then reconfigure the traditional forms of foreign policy. I mean, for some of his key foreign policy moments over the past few years have indeed included his romance with the Soviet Union, his TPP withdrawal, so the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, which was a massive legacy project of Barack Obama, which included really an attempt to bring cohesion and harmonization trade relations between the USA and the European Union, which was suspended, and also a Trans-Pacific program, which was quite similar across the Pacific, across Australia, across Japan, and so on, which was really seen as then making the World Trade Organization quite irrelevant. And that was met with quite controversy at the time. And I think that some of the conversations have continued in that regard. We've also seen the banning, this very controversial travel ban on several, I think 5 or 6 Muslim majority countries. I mean, that's quite pejorative in and of itself. That was already 3 years ago, earlier on in President Trump's term. Not very illustrious term, and that also included a freeze on refugees from countries like Syria, which caused massive tension within that region as well. There was a strike on Syria. There was also an attempt to revisit the NAFTA, which was, of course, the North American Free Trade Agreement, Canada, Mexico, and, of course, the United States. So these are the sorts of things where he's become very insular. I mean, yes, he has tried to make some kind of engagement. He hasn't traveled very much, by the way. I mean, out of all the U.S. presidents in recent years, I think he's been to Saudi Arabia. I think he's been to Israel, the Vatican, Belgium, Italy. He hasn't been to a single African country, which shows of course, the disdain which has been well expressed by him for this continent, both as a people, but also in terms of his estimation of the geopolitics of this. And then of late, of course, he has come true on his promise of departing from the Paris Agreement. And of course, that was, again, part of rubbishing the Obama legacy. And that came into effect about a week ago, which in fact then means that essentially there is no real interest in limiting global warming. Okay. There is no real interest in the pledges which have been made to really come through a sense of internationalism, take accountability for what I think is global climate colonialism. And the U.S. role in that.
Let me jump in and ask this question. So then let's project, obviously the results have not been called in yet, but a Biden presidency, what would it look like? Would he serve his own interests or those of his cohorts? And would that influence some of those factors that you mentioned, alternative sources of fuel or energy, the relations in the Middle East, OPEC, the oil wars there, etc.?
We're probably going to see things, I think that a lot of the work that President Joe Biden has to put into place is rebuilding the bridges that have been ameliorated, put to ashes under the President Trump administration. The war of words with North Korea, the strange relationship with Russia, rolling back the relationship with Cuba, the situation in Afghanistan, which has fallen off of the table to a great extent. Also, some of the internal relationships on migration as well, revisiting the deal on Iran, for example. I think he'd be well placed to go to places like, certain places like Asia, build bridges between South Korea and North Korea, that I think President Trump very painstakingly, did great damage to Vietnam, China. He spent a lot of time there. The recognition of Jerusalem did not go unnoticed by a lot of people, especially anti-Zionists globally, and what that means going forward. And I think also the announcement of tariffs as well. So people have called it a trade war. I think that's very inappropriate language, but trade aggression between China and the US, which is now translated almost into quite a racist, xenophobic, economic xenophobia that President Trump seems to have promoted during his tenure in the last 4 years. So people call this a trade war, but I do think that this the retaliation that China imposed on US products was worth about $3 billion US, which is quite massive. And I think lastly, we need to think around some of the comments he's been making on tightening the borders and what this means in relation to real internationalism. And I think interestingly, whether it's tongue in cheek, there are a few countries which are considering some retaliatory sanctions against the US. I'm not sure how far that will go, but I do think that the work that has to be done is building a new form of internationalism. But I also think that the US has to realize that the world has changed. They should never have played themselves as the prefects of the world. They have never had any legitimacy, being a country that, of course, was built on, colonialism, genocide, human trafficking, the slave trade. I mean, they never had any real legitimacy to pronounce on human rights and democracy. But I also think that the world is much flatter in terms of power and geopolitical power. It is multipolar. And really, I think there's a need for a much greater sense of humility in the way that they converse with the rest of the world.
And I want to end on that note, humility. Is this an opportunity for reform? And is there a need for reform in terms of the US electoral system and the processes that they undertake? Given what has happened now, certainly for the past 2 elections, it's been a build-up and even consideration on how various states themselves administer these elections.
The US Electoral College, remember, is a concession that's about 150 years old. It comes from some of the strange alliances and the strange concessions at the end of the Civil War in the 1860s. The notion of an incomplete franchise, the notion that, of course, Black people, African American people were not full people, they were 3/5 and so forth. And also it was, I think, the logic of having electoral colleges was exactly that, to preserve and to elongate a few elite interests. So the idea was that ordinary people, the man and the woman on the street, were not fit to decide who should govern them. Hence, there was these set-asides. Electoral college, if we view them as voter set-aside of a few corporate interests, a few elite families, and a few elite political powers, it's incredibly outmoded, as is the entire U.S. Constitution. It is clunky. It is absolutely almost impossible for it to, very difficult to get electoral reform and voter reform, constitutional reform. It is only 60 years ago, by the way, that the U.S. themselves deemed that no head of state should have more than 2 terms. That's for a country that has professed to be the doyens of democracy. Is not that long ago. That was under F.D. Roosevelt, the second Roosevelt, who was an incredibly popular leader, but problematically so. So I think that there is scope for so many forms of the constitutional change in the U.S., and the elections have only exposed the need for those changes.
Thank you so much for your time and your insight. Thank you very much, Ms. Lebohang Pheko. She is a political economist, including a senior research fellow at Trade Collective. So later on in the show, we'll be speaking to correspondent Show and Bryce Pease on the latest developments in the elections. As we have been hearing, announcements could be made by either camp later on today. Right, for now, let's take a look at